Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Jauan Jennings, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 17 wide receiver rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups and transitioning into my top 36 rankings. If you guys are looking for my thoughts on an individual player, travel down to the description. There are timestamps available there. While you're down in the description, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and, of course, click the bell notification button besides the daily content in order to help you capture a 2024 fantasy football championship. I'm also answering questions every single day via live stream. Later tonight, after the Seattle Seahawks take on the Chicago Bears, I'll be live here on the channel. If you have any questions regarding your Week 17 lineups, be sure to swing on by. I'm more than happy to help. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by talking about matchups in regards to receiving statistics allowed by each individual defense. Between week 6 through 16, we find that the Vikings, Falcons, Cowboys, Browns, Chargers, Saints, Texans, etc. are the most advantageous matchups. Therefore, someone like Jayden Reed taking on the Minnesota Vikings, very similar in which he did earlier this season against them, could find himself an upside for success, especially considering they can't cover slot receiving options. Therefore, we may be in a position in which we are firing him up within our championship Sunday game. Then we have someone like Terry McLaurin who takes on the Falcons. The Falcons have given up 14 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers in the last 10 to 11 games. If we're going to be in a situation in which Terry McLaurin, who's coming off of a 4 consecutive game streak of scoring a receiving touchdown, has an opportunity of doing that once again this week, of course, we're firing him up as he is a top tier option. Just wanted to go ahead and present some of the more advantageous and also some of the more disadvantageous matchups going into the given week. Even though the Green Bay Packers have allowed the least amount of points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average between week 6 through 16, we're still firing up our studs like Justin Jefferson and, of course, Jordan Addison. Don't let this overall matchup kind of sway you away from the potential of them continuing to light up defenses as they have all season long. And even the last time that they took on this defense, both Jefferson and Addison scoring. All right, let's go ahead and let's transition into my top 36 wide receiver rankings. But before I do so, for those of you who want my all-encompassing rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, you can go ahead and travel down to the description today. Check out Underdog. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew, make that first time deposit minimum of $10. Not only will you be able to claim the first time deposit offer, tail the upcoming entries for the pick'em game, but you could also get my rankings every single Sunday morning, all-encompassing rankings by position, by tier, including flex, half PPR, full PPR. If you're interested, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your current eligibility based on your location. And if in fact you are not eligible, you can always check out the Patreon link down in the description. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go ahead and begin with our number one at the wide receiver position, the auto start, Ja'Marr Chase. Regardless of matchup, whether he takes on Patrick Surtain or whether a DeLorean pulls up prior to the game and a prime tier Darrelle Revis comes out of the car, it doesn't matter who's covering Ja'Marr Chase. You are firing him up this week. He's been the best wide receiver in fantasy football this season. He is going to be the Triple Crown winner, where he is the leader of receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns amongst all wide receivers within a given season. Expect for Ja'Marr Chase to ball out this upcoming Saturday against the Denver Broncos in a potential shootout. Moving on to our number two, the only other wide receiver within the S tier, we have Justin Jefferson. Justin Jefferson is coming off of an incredible performance against the Seattle Seahawks, 10 catches, 144, 2 touchdowns, a legacy game of sorts. But as we go into this week, there's a potential which he can go ahead and ball out once again, like he did earlier this season, back in week 4 against the Green Bay Packers. 6 catches, 85 and a touchdown, 17.5 fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format in a game in which Jair Alexander was not active. Now, going into this week, we're in a situation in which Jair Alexander, who has given Justin Jefferson trouble in the past, is most likely not going to be available. He hasn't played a full healthy game since week 8 this season. And when asked earlier today, Matt LaFleur, the head coach of the Green Bay Packers, was leaning in the direction that Jair Alexander will most likely not be available for them to play. Therefore, Justin Jefferson this week within the matchup, a fantastic play once again. Moving on to our number 3, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. This game against the 49ers is implicated to being the highest scoring game of the week based on Vegas's total. I think it's a 50.5 total. Again, the expectation is that the Detroit Lions are probably going to embarrass the 49ers as they have done to almost every team that they have beat this season. They're trying to put up as many points, 50 pieces if possible. So going into the week, if Amon-Ra St. Brown sees very similar opportunity share in which he did back in 2023 when they took on the San Francisco 49ers in the NFC Championship game. In that game, 11 targets, 7 catches, 87. If he's able to throw a touchdown on top of that overall scoreline, that's the kind of production that we're looking for within the upcoming week's matchup. Of course, as they're trying to embarrass the 49ers and stack up another victory, hopefully Amon-Ra will be heavily implicated as he typically is. Moving on to our number 4, we have Puka Nacua, another one of these wide receivers that's an auto start in 7 of the last 8 full games that he has played thus far this season. And the reason why I say full games is because I don't want to count the game against the Seattle Seahawks in which he got ejected. So in 7 of the last 8 full games, he has gotten himself 7 or more receptions. So if we're going to be in a situation in which Puka Nacua is getting himself on average 7 catches per game, 70 yards, all he really truly does need is a touchdown against the Arizona Cardinals, and really we're not going to be disappointed. The recent disappearance of Cooper Kupp does give more opportunity to Puka Nacua, but it's just purely going to be a matter of, is he going to get those red zone opportunities? As over the course of the last 2 weeks, unfortunately, the LA Rams offense hasn't been scoring at a higher clip in comparison than which they were doing against the Buffalo Bills just a couple weeks back. All right, moving on to our number 5, we have Brian Thomas Jr., the thumbnail of today's episode. Look, Brian Thomas Jr. has played completely out of his mind as of late and truly isn't slowing down. From weeks 14 through 16 with Mac Jones, averaging 13 targets per game and 21.27 fantasy points per game. Being able to get himself a 34% target share within the offense is a ridiculously high number. So of course, we're going to anticipate that he balls out once again this week against the Tennessee Titans, a division rival, a team that they took on back in week 14. In that game, Brian Thomas Jr., 12 targets, 8 catches, 86, 12.6 fantasy points. If he's able to go ahead and tack on another touchdown within the given week, expect for another top 5 performance. Moving on to our number 6 to close out the 8 here, we have Mike Evans. Look, Mike Evans back in week 13 against the Carolina Panthers. 12 targets, 8 catches, 118 and a touchdown, 21.8 half PPR fantasy points. I think that level of production could very easily be accomplished, especially as this team is on the outside looking into the NFL playoff conversation. Considering they lost twice to the Falcons this season, and they currently are in a position in which they have to win out in order to make the playoffs and hope that, of course, the Atlanta Falcons lose, they're going to certainly be looking in the direction of Mike Evans to lead them to the promised land, as he's 182 receiving yards away from the coveted 1,000 receiving yards for an 11 consecutive year. So I assume as the Panthers are trying to stop the run, as they won't be able to against Bucky Irving, it'll open up more and more opportunities for Mike Evans over the top of that defense. Number 7, to begin the B tier, we have A.J. Brown. Regardless of who's playing quarterback. Now, this is under the assumption that Kenny Pickett is playing quarterback. I have A.J. Brown ranked as my number 7 wide receiver, taking on the Dallas Cowboys. The Cowboys, who are the 3rd best matchup at the wide receiver position, allowing 31.55 fantasy points per game on average since week 6. Now, of course, when we travel back to last week, in the absence of Jalen Hurts, we saw with Kenny Pickett, A.J. Brown produced 13 targets, 8 catches, 97 and a touchdown. So regardless of quarterback play, A.J. Brown's still highly relevant. But not only that, Kenny Pickett only had 24 passing attempts. Therefore, 54% of his attempts went in the direction of A.J. Brown last week. A 54% target share is a ridiculous number, and I honestly wouldn't expect it to slow down very much going into this week, assuming Kenny Pickett is active and ready to go. Moving on to our number 8, we have Davante Adams. Davante Adams has gotten himself double-digit targets in 6 of the last 7 games and has scored 6 receiving touchdowns in those 7 games. He continues to ball out. This week, they take on the Buffalo Bills. Earlier this season, of course, the Buffalo Bills struggled mightily against Garrett Wilson. So, of course, we have seen Aaron Rodgers and a top-tier wide receiver dominate against this Buffalo Bills secondary in that game. 8 catches, 107 and a touchdown for Garrett Wilson. So, assume that all that opportunity share is going to go in the direction of Davante Adams, as of late, Aaron Rodgers has just purely been ignoring Garrett Wilson on many of opportunities. The Bills as of late have struggled against wide receivers. Booty last week, 5 catches, 95 and a touchdown. The Detroit Lions wide receivers, 21 catches for 260 and 3 touchdowns. The LA Rams wide receivers, 20 catches for 299 and 2 touchdowns. They are the 8th best matchup at the position. Anticipate Davante Adams to continue his streak of success. Moving on to our number 9. We have T. Higgins. Look, T. Higgins in the last 9 games with Jamar Chase this season, he has out-targeted Chase in 7 of those 9 games. That is a ridiculous number considering, again, he's also outscored Chase in 4 of those 9 games. Jamar Chase, who is leading all wide receivers in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns, even being outscored within his own team is a ridiculous situation, but nonetheless, T. Higgins continues to ball out. Over the course of 5 of the last 6 games, T. Higgins has put up 15 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format in those 5 games in which he is putting up 15 or more fantasy points every single time out with a receiving touchdown. Expect very similar success this week as they take on the Denver Broncos. And of course, regardless of whether or not Patrick Surtain is on his side or on Jamar Chase's side of the field, both are going to succeed. Moving on to our number 10, we have Terry McLaurin taking on the Atlanta Falcons. I mentioned it earlier. The Falcons are the 2nd best matchup at the position, allowing nearly 32 fantasy points per game on average. Of course, Terry McLaurin coming off of a 4 consecutive game streak of scoring 1 receiving touchdown minimum. A couple games there in which he scored 2 receiving touchdowns. But, the fact of the matter is Terry McLaurin has been highly consistent thus far this season. In 7 of his last 8 games, producing 13 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. We're expecting very similar production and potentially even more upside if the touchdowns continue to go in his his direction. Moving on to our number 11, Jaxon Smith-Njigba to close out the B tier. Look, Jaxon Smith-Njigba has got himself 7 consecutive games of 77 or more total yards. The fact of the matter is he is the number 1 receiving option of the Seattle Seahawks offense, and as they take on the Chicago Bears tonight, expect a lot of success, especially considering slot receiving options have found themselves a lot of success recently against the Chicago Bears. Detroit Lions receiving options within the slot position, 4 catches, 57 and a touchdown. Minnesota 5 for 55, with not too much target opportunity in comparison to someone like Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who has been given 12 targets of opportunity in back-to-back games, in which we're hoping later tonight he's able to continue that streak. Moving on to my number 12, we have Malik Nabers of the New York Giants. Look, Malik Nabers, in the last 3 games in which he has had Drew Lock as the starting quarterback, and the only reason I preface that is because Drew Lock is expected to start this week, the volume of targets that he has gotten is ridiculous. 13, 10, and 14. Sure, his fantasy point contributions in a half PPR being 10.3, 11.3, and 12.4 aren't the greatest upside performances, but all you truly do need is a touchdown, because the rest of his overall base of production, targets, receptions, and receiving yards is so strong that all you need is a touchdown to find that upside of an 18-plus point performance. And that's truly all that we're hoping for going into the upcoming matchup. That is the anticipation. If he's able to find that upside, fantastic. If not, still a solid 10-plus point player for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 13, we have CeeDee Lamb. The only issue that I have with CeeDee Lamb going into this week, and the reason why he sits at number 13 rather than a higher position, because the last 3 games he has put up 14-plus fantasy points every single time out. The only concern that I have truly is that shoulder injury. If we're going to be in a situation in which there's a possibility in which he could get tackled, hit the ground the wrong way, and then disappear for the remainder of the game, obviously, that is something that we want to avoid in our championship game. But obviously, he's been able to kind of tough it out and sustain the damage over the course of the last couple of weeks and continues to play. So regardless of the fact that they take on the Philadelphia Eagles matchup, this should be a guaranteed negative game script, which should lead to even more target opportunity for CeeDee Lamb. As long as he's healthy and ready to go, we're firing him up this week. Moving on to our number 14, Tyreek Hill. Now, again, we don't know exactly the status of Jalen Waddle. We'll know by tomorrow for sure as to whether or not he's going to play. Jalen Waddle's absence could lead to even more opportunity for Tyreek Hill, but this most recent performance, only 7 targets, 3 catches, 29 and a touchdown. Not the most upside performance that we could have potentially anticipated in the absence of Jalen Waddle. Nonetheless, they take on the Browns this week, the 4th best matchup at the position. We'll have to keep an eye on the weather as to whether that's going to impact the game. But we have most recently seen Chase, Higgins, and Yoshivas this most recent week against the Cleveland Browns all score touchdowns. So I anticipate that Tyreek Hill at least finds the end zone once and hopefully find himself even more upside within the receiving category over the top of an opposing defense. Number 15, we have Ladd McConkey. Look, the fact of the matter is Ladd McConkey has been highly consistent, even without scoring touchdowns. 5 consecutive games of 11-plus fantasy points in a half PPR, and only one of those games scoring a touchdown. So while he's able to accomplish this, if we're going to be in a situation going against the New England Patriots this week in which Marcus Jones, the primary nickel cornerback who covers slot receiving options, is not going to be available, considering he missed Week 16 and now is expected to miss Week 17 due to this injury, Ladd McConkey should be in a position in which, of course, Christian Gonzalez is on the opposite side of the field, covering Quentin Johnston, and it's just only going to open up more and more opportunity for Ladd McConkey to make plays over the middle of this field like he has done all season long. And of course, find upside against this defense. Earlier today, we did hear some rumors regarding the potential of Gus Edwards not playing. That opens up even more opportunity for the passing game. All right, moving on to our number 16, we have DJ Moore. Look, the fact of the matter is DJ Moore, over the course of the last 4 games in this offense, has not led a single time in terms of scoring. So if they're always going to be implicated within negative game scripts, the target count should continue to stay high. The last 4 games specifically getting 10.5 targets per game on average, which again has led to a lot of receptions in the case of DJ Moore, getting 7+ receptions in 5 of the last 6 games within this offense. So if we're going to be in a situation in which you're taking on the Seattle Seahawks, the weather is going to be implicated to be a solid game where it's not going to negatively impact the passing game, expect for a lot of success, especially considering wide receivers such as Davante Adams, 5 catches, 66 and a touchdown. Dobbs, 40 for 2 receiving touchdowns. Addison scored a touchdown last week, and JJ's coming off of an incredible 10 for 144 and 2 touchdowns. DJ Moore could very easily have himself an upside performance within this game. But not only DJ Moore, so can Keenan Allen, who is another one of these wide receivers that we wanted to mention, who is playing completely out of his mind as of late, has scored 1 receiving touchdown minimum in 4 of the last 5 games he has played. In these games in which he is getting a receiving touchdown, averaging 12.25 targets per game. Again, opportunity leads to success, and as long as Keenan Allen continues to be exposed to a high level of opportunity, considering this team is in a negative game script every single time out, expect them to play incredibly well against the Seattle Seahawks secondary that has struggled mightily as of late. Like I mentioned earlier with DJ Moore, they allowed JJ to score a touchdown, Addison to score a touchdown, Dobbs 2 touchdowns, Davante Adams a touchdown. Keenan Allen's next on this list. Moving on to our number 18. Speaking of Jordan Addison, Jordan Addison has scored 1 receiving touchdown minimum in 5 of the last 8 games. When we travel back to earlier this season when they took on the Green Bay Packers, in that game, Jordan Addison scored 2 touchdowns and 21.4 fantasy points. With Jair Alexander out going into this weekend's matchup, and the second cornerback having to cover Justin Jefferson in all of those efforts, and them trying to bundle up Jefferson as much as they possibly can, it's only going to open up more and more opportunity on the opposite side of the field for Jordan Addison to continue his fantasy streak of success. Moving on to our number 19, we have Adam Thielen. Look, he's played incredibly well since returning from his injured reserve stint. Obviously, Bryce Young and his efforts has certainly elevated Adam Thielen. When we travel back to week 13 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who they will be playing this week, he had himself 10 targets, 8 catches, 99 and a touchdown for 19.9 fantasy points, and should have had himself a second receiving touchdown within that game if it wasn't for the fact that, the referees called it a little bit sideways. I thought his knee came down either way. Going into this week's matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, a team that, of course, is still trying to fight for the playoffs, but as of late, the Carolina Panthers have certainly played upset special, knocking 4 teams out of the playoff contention in 4 weeks here. We're going to be in a situation in which Dave Canales, the former offensive coordinator of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the head coach and play caller of the Panthers, is going to have himself another revenge game. Last time out against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers was an overtime matchup. We're hoping for something very similar within a shootout. Moving on to our number 20, we have Deebo Samuel. Look, Deebo Samuel, over the course of the last couple weeks, this offense has come out and said, whether it was Kyle Shanahan, whether it's Deebo, whether it's Purdy, they want to get him more implicated, and certainly that has been the case. There has been a concerted effort to get him touches this most recent week. 9 targets, 7 catches, 5 rushing attempts. If you're going to touch the ball 10 plus times within a given game, whether it is rushing attempts or receptions, expect for fantasy upside. If it wasn't for the fact that he dropped that touchdown, against the LA Rams, would be a 2-game consecutive streak of scoring touchdowns and getting himself ample opportunity share. Considering all the injuries within this backfield, of course, Isaac Guerrero still a question mark as for this week. Deebo Samuel will have himself opportunities to run the ball, be the number 1 receiving option, especially against the secondary that has given up top 10 points to opposing wide receivers as of late. Moving on to our number 21, we have Courtland Sutton, who's coming off a performance in which he was, yes, quite underwhelming, but understand that Courtland Sutton, prior to this most recent game in which he only put up 7.5 fantasy points, had a 7-game consecutive streak of 10 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Now this week they take on the Cincinnati Bengals. The Cincinnati Bengals recently have given up 93 and a touchdown to Lamb, 74 and a touchdown to Pickens, 123 to Lad McConkey. We've seen many of wide receivers find success. As of late, the last 2 weeks, the Cincinnati Bengals have taken on DTR and Will Levis. So they've abused the fact that they've taken on lesser quarterbacks. I expect Bo Nix and Courtland Sutton to find upside this week. Moving on to our number 22, we have Drake London. Now, this is under the assumption that Drake London, who is dealing with a hamstring injury this most recent Sunday against the New York Giants, of course, left that game early due to said injury. We're assuming that he's going to be at a full healthy capacity. If, in fact, he is, and if we're going to be in a situation in which we're monitoring Marshawn Lattimore's primary status, again, he is the number 1 cornerback of the Washington Commanders defense. If he's going to be inactive and London's going to be active, this leads to a lot of potential for upside, mainly because I do anticipate the Atlanta Falcons to be in a negative game script for the entirety of this game. If that's going to be the case, Drake London, who led this team in targets last week with Michael Penix and dropped the receiving touchdown on the goal line fade, certainly has himself even more opportunities to succeed within the upcoming matchup. Moving on to our number 23, we have Jauan Jennings. Look, taking on this defense should be an easy matchup. They're the 10th best at the position, allowing 28.46 fantasy points per game. We would anticipate that Jennings, as the number 3 option behind Kittle and Deebo, again, is going to get himself less of an opportunity share than he has seen earlier this season, but nonetheless still has himself enough value to be a relevant fantasy option within the given week at a top 24 capacity, mainly because, of course, this is going to be a guaranteed negative game script, and of course, he should see himself upwards of 7 to 8, if not hopefully double-digit targets this week. Moving on to our number 24, we have Cooper Kupp. It's quite interesting how he has disappeared in the fantasy playoffs. In the 2 most important weeks of the season, if you somehow survived with Cooper Kupp and his underwhelming performances, this may be a week in which you're looking to an alternative option potentially, but hopefully going into this week, considering the Rams are once again in another one of these playoff games in which they have to win in order to get themselves advancing to the NFL playoffs to win their division, hopefully Cooper Kupp will get a little bit more love this week, especially considering the Rams offense over the course of the last 2 games have truly been underwhelming. I know that they've been going with a run-heavy approach, and that is typically the identity of the LA Rams, but they certainly need to look in the direction of Cooper Kupp more often. Hopefully that's going to be the case this week. Moving on to our number 25, we have Jalen McMillan. Look, McMillan has scored at least 1 receiving touchdown in 3 consecutive games. K. Dotton for another consecutive week is probably expected to miss. If that's going to be the case, and teams are continuing to double, if not triple cover, Mike Evans on a weekly basis, expect for this game against the Panthers to be a shootout, and of course for Baker Mayfield to continue to look in the direction of Jalen McMillan down in the red zone because they are designing plays in order to find him open. for touchdowns. Moving on to our number 26. Speaking of scoring touchdowns, we have Jameson Williams, who, again, it only takes one singular play to make his fantasy week. And he accomplished this most recent week against the Chicago Bears. Now, even in games in which he hasn't scored touchdowns as of late, he's still scoring about 7 to 10 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. So if we're going to be in a situation in which he's able to take the top off of this opposing defense, or at very least get himself the ample opportunity he deserves, he can certainly still be implicated for a lot of potential for upside. Last time out against the San Francisco 49ers in that NFC Championship game, Jameson Williams scored 2 touchdowns, one on the ground, one through the air. That was really his launching point as to why he has found so much success this season, considering that performance against that 49ers defense. Moving on to our number 27, we have Calvin Ridley. Like we mentioned earlier this week, with Mason Rudolph taking over the starting position, again, we have seen in the last 4 games with Mason Rudolph, Calvin Ridley in week 7, 8, 9, and 16 averaged 12.1 fantasy points per game on 9.25 targets per game. If we're going to be in a situation in which the ample opportunity share continues to go in the direction of Calvin Ridley with Mason Rudolph as the starting quarterback, anticipate a lot of potential for upside, especially considering, back in week 14 against the Jacksonville Jaguars, his former team, a revenge game, he had 12 targets, 7 catches, 59, and 9.4 fantasy points with Will Levis. I expect even more upside within the upcoming matchup. Moving on to our number 28, we have DeVonta Smith. Now, this is under the assumption that Kenny Pickett is the starting quarterback. Again, this most recent week with Kenny Pickett, 7 targets, a 29% target share, a pretty solid opportunity share. But taking on the Dallas Cowboys, again, yes, they are the 3rd best matchup at the position, but it's purely going to be a matter of, is DeVonta Smith going to score a receiving touchdown? If he doesn't, he sits at number 28. In the event in which he scores a touchdown, certainly will be in the top 24 conversation by the end of this week. Speaking of scoring touchdowns, let's keep on the topic. Let's talk about DK Metcalf, who this most recent week, obviously there was a lot of chatter regarding the team wanting to get him more touches and more looks. Only had 3 catches, 57, but luckily scored a touchdown for many of our fantasy teams. Going into tonight's matchup against the Chicago Bears, my only concern is Jalen Johnson. As long as DK Metcalf can avoid Jalen Johnson and go to the other side of the field where Stevenson is playing, he will find success. Jalen Johnson has been a shutdown corner all season long, and that is the only thing that truly scares me going into tonight's game regarding Metcalf's upside. Moving on to our number 30, we have Jakobi Meyers, who quite frankly was just kind of ignored last week within this offense. They denied to give him a higher overall workload of opportunity, mainly because they were running the ball as effectively as they were and continuing to dump off the ball to Amir Abdullah and Alexander Mattison. Going into this weekend's matchup could be much of the same, considering they're taking on the Saints. If that Saints offense is going to be dysfunctional in the absence of Derek Carr, Alvin Kamara, etc., all their studs, there's maybe a situation in which Aiden O'Connell continues to just look in the direction of Brock Bowers and the running backs continue to take over this game. Even though this is the 6th best matchup, I'm not 100% confident on the status of Jakobi Meyers. Moving on to our number 31, we have Khalil Shakir. Again, when there are so many weapons within this offense that can find success, and really nobody is getting themselves a incredibly healthy workload of opportunity, Khalil Shakir really as of late has been having to hang his hat on the fact that he has scored touchdowns. Now going into this week, luckily for him, they're going to be in a situation in which Michael Carter II, their primary nickel cornerback, is most likely going to be out. Considering Khalil Shakir functions out of the slot receiving role, this certainly helps. But if we're going to be in a situation in which the Bills going into this game don't have a healthy Josh Allen, they may decide to sit him. We'll have to wait and see. The expectation is that's not going to happen, mainly because, keep in mind, the Bills and the Ravens have a very close kind of win-loss record. The Ravens beat them in the head-to-head matchup. The Bills want to sustain a home playoff game if they were to take on the Ravens this upcoming playoff schedule. So if we're going to be in a situation in which the Bills are expected to sit their players, I doubt that to be the case because, again, they want to have home field advantage up until they take on the Kansas City Chiefs. All right, moving on to our number 32, we have Garrett Wilson. Look, Garrett Wilson, like I mentioned earlier, considering the volume of targets that Davante Adams has gotten over the course of the last 7 consecutive games, 6 of those games with 10 or more targets, we've really seen Garrett Wilson be ignored as of late. Even though back in week 6 against the Buffalo Bills, Garrett Wilson went for 107 and a touchdown, 20.7 half PPR fantasy points. And even though this is a top tier matchup, the fact of the matter is Garrett Wilson continues to be ignored within this offense, even though he's wide open on plays on 4th down. Aaron Rodgers is throwing a 15-yard fade to Davante Adams that lands 3 yards out of bounds. The fact of the matter is, unfortunately, Garrett Wilson is just being ignored, and because of that, at times, we're just going to have to look away from him for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 33, speaking of being ignored, we really didn't expect Marvin Harrison Jr. to get himself this kind of a lack of opportunity share. Even though this most recent week, 8 targets, only 4 catches for 39. He's given opportunities here and there to score touchdowns, but ultimately isn't able to bring it down. This week, they take on the LA Rams. Earlier this season against the Rams in week 2, went for 27 fantasy points. His best game of the season, 4 catches for 130 and 2 touchdowns. Able to make 2 plays over the top of the Rams secondary. If he's able to find himself success this week, that wouldn't be a surprise, especially considering we have seen A.J. Brown, Khalil Shakir, Amari Cooper, Davante Adams all find themselves success in the most recent weeks. We're just hoping that Marvin Harrison's given the ample opportunity share to succeed. Moving on to our number 34, Jayden Reed. Earlier this season against the Minnesota Vikings, 7 catches, 139 and a touchdown. If we're going to be in a situation in which, again, this is going to be an expected shootout, the Vikings can't cover slot receiving options. Again, the Seattle Seahawks this most recent week, their slot receiving options, 10 catches for 103 and a touchdown. Keenan Allen, most recently against the Minnesota Vikings, 6 for 82 and a touchdown, 9 for 86 and a touchdown. Expect for the Minnesota Vikings to have trouble with Jayden Reed this week, assuming he gets the opportunity share he deserves. Moving on to our number 35, Darnell Mooney. In a negative game script, we should anticipate Darnell Mooney to be the primary number 1. But in the event in which, Drake London doesn't leave this game early, isn't dealing with a potential injury, and Marshawn Lattimore is out, expect for Drake London to get himself the vast majority of opportunity share, but the number 2 receiving option to be Darnell Mooney, who again played incredibly well this most recent week with Michael Penix. Moving on to our number 36, it's Jerry Jeudy. If we're going to be in a situation which DTR, who did not practice on Wednesday, is going to potentially not be available this week against the Miami Dolphins matchup, and somehow, someway, Jameis Winston jumps back into the conversation, then Jerry Jeudy is an available option to play. I leave him at number 36 because I don't know the status of DTR. I don't know the status of Jameis Winston. It may be Bailey Zappi playing quarterback this week for the Browns. We'll have to wait and see, but either way, just wanted to go ahead and throw out Jerry Jeudy's name for those of you who are wondering where he's at. All right, guys. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll be back later tonight after the Seattle Seahawks take on the Chicago Bears, and of course tomorrow with quarterback and tight end rankings. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.